Alright guys, so back to part 2. We're going to be looking now no longer at a relative cell reference, but now the absolute cell reference, right? So earlier in the relative cell reference, we saw how you can point a formula at one place and then Excel will, when you copy that formula over to another cell, Excel will move the formula adjacently or relatively speaking to where you paste it, right? So now with absolute cell references, we're going to switch it up a bit. We're going to say, hey Excel, we don't want you to look at this in relative terms either at all, or we don't want you to look at relative terms when we're talking about the columns, or we don't want you to look at this in terms of relative when we're talking about the row numbers, right? So let me show you what we're talking about. First, to tell Excel that you want something no longer relative, that you want it absolute, you do that by adding a $sign. So in your formulas, when we're putting formulas together, if you add a $sign, it will change how Excel carries out copies of that formula that you paste elsewhere, because the $sign will change part of the formula or all of the formula from looking at things relative to looking at things like I need you to look at this spot absolutely all the freaking time over here, right? So earlier I showed you guys this example, right? So we said if we have this formula pointing at the cell over here, we copy this cell over one spot, Excel updates the formula to be over one spot, right, relative to where it originally looked at, right? So now what we're going to do is we're going to point over here, right, but we're going to hit the F4 key. That's a shortcut for adding in absolute references. I hit F4 once and it gives me a $sign in front of the letter B and a $sign in front of the letter 22, right? So if I try to copy this formula over to the next cell, if we were speaking relative, you would see the formula pointing at the next cell over. But since we're speaking in absolute terms, ready? I'm going to copy the formula over one cell, and our outcome is still the same, right? If I copy the formula down one cell, the outcome is still the same again. If I copy the formula somewhere random now, let's say over here, look at that, it still says over here. If I click into the formula bar, it's still pointing to that original cell that we locked onto. Okay, ready? So what happened here, if we go back to the formula, right? What happened here is, oh, wrong one. We told Excel, in our formula, I want you to lock the cell and I want you to lock the row. So effectively we're saying, Excel, stay locked on column B and stay locked on row 22. So stay locked at this address, right? That's what the $sign says, and that's why when we copy this formula and paste it anywhere else, it still gives us the same value, right? Now let me show you different iterations of the absolute, right? Well, let's leave that there. So let's get rid of this stuff. Now we're going to take this over here and say below, above, left one. Let's format all this 06, 02. Those are my shortcuts. Ready? So, and I want to copy this formatting, paste it over here so you can do this little brush. Okay, oh, and I want everything centered still. Ready? So now here we have, again, this formula locked to the column and to the row number, right? Let's see what happens when we take the same formula, we get rid of the $, right? So now if you read the formula, it says, Excel, I want you to lock to column B, right, over here, but because we didn't give a $sign to the row number, that isn't locked, right? So if we don't lock the row number, what happens if we copy this formula down? Look at that, you get below, right? So now the row number changed. Now let's move over one cell to the right. So we still have freedom as far as the rows go, right? But we don't have that freedom as far as the columns go. So we should see the same output. Ready? We should see the word below if we paste this formula in, and that's right, we see below again. So let's take this below and put it all the way over here, right? Paste it over here. It's still looking at the same value of below because the column is locked. Although the row isn't, the column is. Since we pasted the formula on the same row, you're still pointing at below. Now, if we take this below, copy the formula, Control C, paste it another one below, and now we get 0, right? So look at that. Now, the row isn't locked like we know. So now, when you move down one row, you're looking at nothing. So Excel returns 0. Let's copy this over, move one cell to the right. Now what do we get? We get 0 again, because even though the column is locked, the row is still unlocked, but we're still in the same row, right? So you still get that blank where Excel returns 0. Now let's take this another direction. Let's say we get rid of this $sign, so we unlock the column, but then we add a $sign to the row number, so we're locked to row 22, right? So let's copy this and let's copy this formula and let's move down one row and paste the formula with Control V, and now the row number is locked, right? Same exercise as before, but now instead of locking the column, we lock the row number, so we're transfixed on this row, right? Now let's move over to the right one, paste the formula, and because we didn't lock the column, we should see the output be this me next. Ready? So we copied it with Control C, move over one cell, paste it with Control V, and now we get me next. All right, so now the freedom or the relativeness is only pointed at the column, right? So Excel keeps the columns relative, but it's locked onto this row. So now, since we locked to row 22, if we copy this formula down one row, oh, no, we already went through that. So, well, yeah, so we'll go through it again. If we move it down, copy it, we know that the row is still locked, like always. So Excel gives you technically 4 different outputs, right? So those 4 outputs, we'll write them down. Right, but first, let's talk about C for column, R for the row, and we know we can either have a relative cell reference or an absolute cell reference. And for relative, let's just say unlocked is the key, although we know the default for relative cell references is to not add a $sign. So then for absolute cell references, the $sign is what symbolizes or signifies an absolute cell reference. So using this legend or this key are 4 scenarios, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. So our column could be locked, right? So an absolute reference on the column, while the row is unlocked, right? So relative cell reference. or the column could be unlocked, right? So relative cell reference in the column, and the row could be locked, or we could have situation, or the default is where both the column and the row are unlocked. In other words, they're both relative cell references. And finally, we could have situations where the column is locked as well as the row is locked, right? So that's our 4 different scenarios. So just so you guys keep this in mind, gonna add some borders, make this grid look nice. But basically, absolute cell references help you lock columns, help you lock rows, keep don't do any absolute cell references, which is a default and everything's relative, or it helps you lock both columns and rows, right? So if you keep these in mind and you understand that absolute is signified with a $sign in the formula, then this can help you get through work a little bit faster than not, right? So now let's move on to our example. So in the relative cell reference video, we went through the example where we wanted to figure out the tax amount due on a bunch of sales, right, given a specific tax rate. So what we did using relative cell references, so we multiplied the sales value of the order times the tax rate, and we copied that formula all the way down, knowing that we have relative cell references, right? But in order to accomplish this, what we had to do is we had to add this column tax rate in, right? So how can we use absolute cell references to calculate the tax rate without, or the tax amount due without having to copy the tax rate down to each row? Well, let's look at that now, right? We're going to add in the new column where we're going to do calculations, and we're going to say absolute cell reference. Oh, fat fingered that one. Now double click on the column to make it open up. See that? It auto sizes. Okay, so now we're going to take what we just learned, right? We know we're always going to need the sales dollar value, right, for each order. So we're going to say that multiplied now. What do we multiply that by? We multiply that by our tax rate. Our tax rate is 7%. Even though we're going to copy this formula down, even though we're going to copy this formula down and we know we want to multiply against each of these sales dollars for each order, we want to multiply against this tax rate, but this tax rate isn't going to move from this position, right? So even while we copy the formula down, we don't want this formula to change from this row number, right? So given that we don't want the row number to change, we're going to add in a $sign to tell Excel, do not change the row number even though we're going to move where the formula is copied, right? So now what's going to happen is, right, we're going to copy this formula down. So far so good, right? The tax, oh, why did I make this rate? It should be tax dollar. I'm sorry, guys. So the tax dollar matches the original, right? Look at this, they both match. Now, because we've locked the row number in, we should see this formula do the same, give us the same output. But now, instead of referencing every 7% that's up and down this order table, it's only going to reference the 7% that's anchored over here, right? So let's copy this down and see if we get 315 for this tax dollar. And look at that. Now let's highlight click into the formula bar to highlight our cells, and you can see that while the sales move down a row along with the formula, the row for the tax rate is locked at row 19, right? Which is exactly what we want. So now we'll copy and paste down another row, and we're at 728, which matches the original tax dollar using this formula with relative cell references. So now Control C to copy, and let's paste across everywhere we want the formula, and we can just double check, right? 609 versus 609, that looks good. 854 versus 854, that looks good. 497, 497, that looks good. And even if we sum these columns up, 123.69 versus 123.69, right? So by using absolute cell references, we were able to eliminate a whole nother step of adding in this column, right? This tax rate column, to help our formula calculate. So using the absolute cell references, we just had one spot where we had to have that tax rate and then locked onto that specific spot, this time based on the row number, and our formula did the same thing as the formula we looked at when we were working with relative cell references. So take this forward with you guys. This is a time saver, and this is honestly a necessity when you're a data analyst, and especially when it comes to creating reports. Understanding absolute versus relative cell references is a necessity. Like always, if you guys have any questions, let me know in the comments, and I'll do my best to clear anything up. And like always, smash that like and smash that subscribe button. Alright guys, I'll catch you later.